give permission or say got. I think it's got it. I like that language. That's casual. You can do that. We are recording these. We're still trying to figure out how we'll be using them, but we will be sure to let you know. And we'll be following up next week with any links from any and all of our speakers as well. So with that, let's jump in 12:02 because we got a hard stop at noon because we are busy people doing good, important things. So welcome to day 2 of Conversations That Matter. This, of course, is a partnership between the good folks at 4 Simple Words and the great folks at PIN Network, which is based in Guelph, Wellington, and you can find them at pinnetwork.ca. And if you joined us yesterday, you heard the story. Kim and I were chatting. What could we do? What would be fun? Let's invite smart people and have a conversation with them. And fortunately, Kim and I are blessed to have a network of really smart people, including Cathy Taylor. So excited to be spending time with Cathy, and we'll formally introduce her in a bit. And we just wanted to acknowledge and celebrate the good work that is happening in our not-for-profit sector. And we are so grateful that you are taking time out of your day to join us. So we appreciate that. Before we jump in, let's start with our land acknowledgement. We're going to do this every day, of course, because this is important for all of us to be grounding ourselves in our conversation. And again, we're coming together from across the province today. And a reminder that no matter where you are sitting, no matter where your screen is, there were peoples, cultures, and traditions on these very lands long before we were. And these wise people did their best to help us steward our land, our water, and our air. They tried to teach us how to steward our land, water, and our air. And unfortunately, we have done a terrible job at listening to their wisdom. And our environment is now paying that price. Even worse, in fact, it's much worse. We have yet to fully acknowledge that our communities are literally built on top of theirs. And as a country, we can no longer turn away from the social, economic, and emotional damage that we have done to generations of families across this country. And as we're thinking about the values of building community and supporting one another and serving one another, I want to remind us that those are values that started with our Indigenous sisters and brothers in those cultures so many years ago. And it's our honor to be carrying those on today. And I really believe it's up to us to remind future leaders that are going to follow in our footsteps that they are in fact continuing that tradition of Indigenous culture and learning and growth. So I have no solutions for us today on how to formally right relations with our Indigenous sisters and brothers. I know I'm just coming to terms with the word settler and what that means. I'm trying to figure that out. What I want to encourage us today is to remember how lucky we are to be on the land that we are, and that it is indeed stolen. And here in Ontario and Canada, we have to remember that truth has to come before reconciliation. So with that, I want to again welcome everyone and thank you for being here today. And we are in fact celebrating Ontario's first nonprofit appreciation week. And I just wanted to throw out a few stats to remind us of the scale and scope of this great sector that we are part of. We had some numbers yesterday, and I thought that'd be a fun thing to continue on for each of our days. It's probably stating the obvious, but Ontario's not-for-profit sector is Canada's largest. So I think that's probably a safe assumption. Well, we knew that probably just by the size of Ontario, but Ontario's not-for-profit sector is Canada's largest. But here's something I didn't know until like 20 minutes ago. Ontario's not-for-profit sector contributes to the economy more than automotive and construction sectors combined. The not-for-profit, I'm going to say that again because it blew me away. The not-for-profit sector, and Cathy, make sure I'm being accurate here. The not-for-profit sector contributes more to the Ontario economy than automotive and construction combined. That just blew me away. I had no idea that it was that big. And just before we jumped on, we were chatting about, when remember when we used to get together at parties and chat and chat with people? People would say, what do you do? I work in the not-for-profit sector. So often people would glaze over, not fully appreciating what that is. And yet look at the scale and scope we have, right? Another interesting fact about our sector is that Ontario nonprofits earn almost half of their funding from outside government grants and funding. I think that's huge. And that is a testament to our good friends called fundraisers who are out there matching people's dreams with our organizations, right? That is an art and a science. And I see some fundraisers on the call today, some very good ones. So a chance to celebrate and remember just how lucky we are to have that skill set in our sector. So we are big, we are impactful, and we've got some challenges ahead of us and some conversations to have. And that's really what we're doing this week. And this week we are thinking about, with Cathy from ONN, and we'll introduce her formally in a second, some of the changes that have happened over the past 2 years around COVID in particular, and what that means for our organizations and then for our sector. So we're getting ready for that conversation with Cathy. I encourage you to be thinking about questions for Cathy, and you can start to drop those into the chat. Before we do, just a quick, I want to take 3 or 4 minutes just to again chat quickly about 4 simple words. A reminder, if you didn't join us yesterday, that this is my journey on better understanding what it means to be in service to others. The 4 simple words were a gift from my grandmother. The 4 simple words are, it's not about me. They've profoundly impacted my life as a man, as a business owner, as a father, as a partner, and hopefully as a community leader as well. And yesterday we quickly chatted about why I think the time for servant leadership is over, because when I'm acting as a servant to you, where are you? There you are. When I'm acting as a servant to you, we can't be in equity. We can't be in an equitable situation, but we are acting in service to one another. We can in fact have equity grounded into that relationship. So that was what we chatted about yesterday. One of the reasons that I believe in this idea of service leadership. And today I just want to quickly circle back to this idea of it's not about me. And again, this is my grandmother's wisdom that I was so blessed to have. And there's 3 ways I feel it impacts us. So I want to plant a seed with you, and I welcome your feedback and your pushback on this, in fact, because to be clear, I don't have all the answers, but I have lots of questions. So 3 things I think it's not about me does for us as leaders in the not-for-profit sector. First of all, it simplifies our life, right? Because when it's not about me, all those small things that rub us the wrong way and that can take over our energy and joy just don't do that anymore. You know, that rude email you got this morning from your colleague that was really short and terse, and you kind of wondered, what did I do to bother her? That's not about me. That's about a mom with a sick kid at home who's trying to figure out how to manage work and life and make sure that their kid is feeling better, right? As a service leader, I can't or won't let the stress or negative energy of others knock me off my course, because that stress isn't about me. I can empathize with you and I can support you, and I will do my best to help you, but I'm not going to let that energy consume my day, because I have serving to do. So number 1 thing about it's not about me, it simplifies our life because it just allows us to put up our hand to some of that negative energy. Number 2, I believe it's not about me allows us to clear our mind. And this one for me, this is probably where it started, in fact, for me, is that when it's not about me, I'm able to focus on meeting the needs of others. And when I'm focused on meeting the needs of others, there's no room up here for that tiny little voice in my head saying, I'm not good enough, no one cares, or constantly questioning my skills or abilities. As a service leader, my time and my energy and my focus are filled with this idea of serving others. And there's absolutely no room for that nagging voice. My energy isn't being consumed by doubt. Instead, it's being fueled by a sense of purpose. And that's been a huge gift for my grandmother, is that sense of purpose. So number 1, it's not about me, simplifies our life. Number 2, it clears our minds. Finally, number 3, it amplifies our impact. Because when we're focused on the needs of others, we begin to measure success differently. And this is what I love, especially as we think about empowering and nurturing other leaders that follow us. Rather than just calculating our own wins and accomplishments, we now have permission. In fact, we're encouraged to be creating and seeing others win and have just as much success as I do. Because service leaders know that when I celebrate the success and wins of others, I'm not detracting from my own. In fact, it's one and the same. So it's not about me. It can simplify our life, it can clear our mind, and it can amplify your impact. Those are my thoughts. Pushback. Tell me what you think at kurt@4simplewords.ca. Join us at 4simplewords.ca to learn more. And I do welcome your thoughts on service leadership and how it can be impacting us as a sector. All right, lecture over. Thanks for listening, everyone. On to our guest today, who I'm super excited to be spending time with. In fact, I think Cathy, the last time I saw Cathy Taylor was in person right at the beginning of COVID. So we haven't seen Cathy since, so it's a gift to reconnect. So today we are really lucky to have Cathy Taylor, who's the Executive Director of the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network, joining us. You can find them at theonn.ca, and Cathy on social is ctaylor_ONN. So I'll quick update about Cathy, and then we'll jump into our conversation. Cathy, who uses the pronouns she and her, has been a member of the ONN team since June 2012. Through her almost 30 years working in the not-for-profit sector, including as the founding executive director of the Volunteer Center in Guelph, Wellington, now known as PIN. So everything's coming full circle here. Look at that, eh? She's passionate about collaboration and leadership in the sector. Cathy works with sector colleagues from across Ontario and Canada, as well as the private sector and government officials to, and get this, I love this language, create an enabling policy environment for not-for-profit environments. I'm going to say that again because I had to wrap my head around that. They're working to create an enabling policy environment for not-for-profit organizations. Cathy's roots are in the environmental movement, and she's been active in municipal politics. Outside of work, she enjoys time with her family, cross-country skiing in farmer fields in Erin, where she lives and sometimes works. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm Conversations That Matter welcome to the great Cathy Taylor. Cathy.
Hi, Kurt. Good to see everyone. It's always nice to join my fellow colleagues in Guelph.
Thanks so much for being here, Cathy. And before we jump in, ONN has done a lot to push for and create this Not-Profit Appreciation Week. Tell us a bit about how that came about and what else is happening across the province. Give us some context on what else is happening.
Yeah, sure. And apologies, someone just drove in with the delivery, so the dog went nuts. So even though the door is shut, so apologies, you can hear that. It was really the dream of the Biana Family Foundation to have a nonprofit recognition week in Ontario. It's the first one in Canada. There's a nonprofit recognition day in Nova Scotia, and this is the sort of second recognition, and it's a full week here. Of course, the Ontario government wanted to expand it a bit. Really, it was all the legislature, so all four political parties at Queen's Park supported this private members bill to have an appreciation week for nonprofit sector workers specifically. We have a national volunteer week that recognizes volunteers across the country. And this week really is about recognizing those workers in the nonprofit and charitable sector that have gone far and beyond, especially during the pandemic, but even before then. So it's been pretty short notice. The legislature just passed the recognition week in December. So pretty quick to try and figure out something for 2022. But it is this period of time, the third week of February or the second week of February, forever. It's in the legislation now. So it is declared by the province of Ontario.
Excellent. And can you paint us a picture of what else is happening around the province?
Yeah, a whole bunch of stuff. Like it really is, from our perspective, the advantage of this is really decentralizing, sharing some messages out and encouraging folks to use it however they wish in their communities. So we have lots of corporate and private sector organizations like chambers of commerce and big businesses and foundations, recognizing and thanking nonprofit workers for doing their work. We have businesses like in Orangeville, they're giving coffee. A couple of places in Orangeville and Shelburne are providing coffee and samosas for volunteers, thanks to the Dufferin Community Foundation. Other organizations are using this opportunity to do some recognition within their own organizations for their staff, staff recognition activities. So it really is, everybody's doing something different this year. So it'll be fun to kind of capture what has been happening.
Excellent. Great. Well, thanks for that update, Cathy. And again, thanks for your organization's help in bringing this together. So we're thinking about the not-for-profit sector here in Ontario this week. And we're also reflecting on the past 2 years, right? Which have been, this incredible journey, and that's doing it a disservice in terms of its scale and scope. But I think the conversation we want to have today is what impact has the past 2 years had on our sector? And what are some of those opportunities that we can take from that, both individually and organizationally? So maybe just a quick starting with this idea of a new normal. And Cathy, let's reflect on this together. The Wikipedia definition is a new normal is a state in which an economy, society, etc., settles following a crisis when this differs from the situation that prevailed prior to the start of the crisis. So essentially, something has fundamentally changed at a large scale. And Cathy, does that kind of resonate with when you think about new normal? Is that a lens you could put our conversation through? How does that relate for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, the pandemic has really shown some things that, haven't changed in the value of nonprofits and the work that they do across communities, but a lot of how we do our work, that the folks that support our work, the systems, the processes that impact our work, how governments view our work, a lot has changed dramatically. And there are some things that we hope continue. So I would never say there's a silver lining to this pandemic, given the impact on the health and well-being of Ontarians and certainly across the world. But there is an opportunity to take this moment and really transform our sector, as well as for the purpose of course, supporting our community. So I do think there is a potential for a new normal. I think it's also easy to slide back into old patterns, and that's something that we can dive into in terms of whose patterns and what kind of patterns.
Right.
But I do think there is a new normal, and there's an opportunity for us right in this moment.
So we want to get to that and encourage people to start thinking about questions for Cathy around what that new normal looks like, and encourage you to drop those in the chat. Before we go there, Cathy, how would you describe our sector today, in general, having gone through the past 2 years? What are some of those big shifts that you've seen from ONN?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I would say, so the first big thing is our sector is still standing. We have lots of folks over the years, and I'm sure everybody on this call has heard that, sometimes the nonprofit sector and charities aren't as innovative as other sectors, or, we're not as technologically savvy, or we're behind an ABC. The pandemic has shown that, our sector is incredibly innovative. The fact that we're all still serving our communities, have pivoted overnight, with the interests of our communities that we serve, however we describe them, clients, participants, colleagues, at the forefront of what we do, it frankly has been remarkable. We have lost a lot of nonprofits and charities in the last 2 years. We've also gained more colleagues and supporters throughout that time. I think the overall impact on the sector, because the sector is so broad, if you think about types of organizations, arts and culture, sports and recreation, social services, healthcare, the pandemic has had a really uneven impact on our sector. So those folks in the sports and arts sectors, they were closed for months and months and months. They lost all of their staff. All of their revenue was more ticket sales, fee for service, earned income. So they were devastated in a particular way. Whereas our social and health services were open, they were considered essential, probably didn't lose too much funding, but the need and the demand for their services has completely outgrown anything they could imagine, and they can't keep up often with their services. So the sector has had an uneven impact, but overall we've done 3 surveys during the pandemic, and overall the big message is demand is up, revenue is down, volunteers are down, staff are burnt out, and it's not a sustainable system going forward.
Which circles back to those of you that joined us yesterday on our chat with Mike around burnout, and sustainability was a word we kept coming back to a fair bit. So let's circle back to that, Cathy, because that's a really good point. Maybe Kim, this is a good time to throw out, to Cathy's point, let's throw out the poll, Kim, please and thank you. I think organizations have been impacted differently. So we're just kind of curious from where you're sitting and, representing the organizations that you are today. You'll see a poll there. COVID has fundamentally changed our organization. Be interested in your thoughts on that. 1 is strongly disagree, and 5 is strongly agree. And you've got a range there. So we'll give you a minute to fill that in. And then Cathy, maybe we could reflect on those numbers And then this idea around demand going up and money going down, which I think is probably the biggest tension. Is that the biggest tension? Is that a fair observation?
I think that's a fair observation, that's the biggest tension. The fact that, we've also lost a lot of our volunteers, not purposefully, because not anything our sector has done, but by virtue of not physically being open or being, it's safe to have volunteers. And also the fact that as our volunteers have aged over the years, that aging demographic isn't so keen to volunteer during a pandemic. So that's another big tension, I think.
Yes. So let's chat about that as well. So if we, thanks to Kim, there's our results. You should be on your screen there. You'll see that 66% agree or disagree, agree or strongly agree with the statement that COVID has fundamentally changed our organization. And I'm wondering, can I get people to thanks, Kim, in the chat, maybe just tell us what those changes look like. I'd be curious to know that. Maybe Cathy, we could reflect on that a little bit, what some of those changes looked at. So for those of you that said it had changed, can you give us a quick summary in the chat of what that looks like? And Cathy, we're chatting about volunteers later on. I think it's tomorrow, in fact.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the impact this has had on volunteers and the stress that's bringing to organizations. Maybe you can set us up for tomorrow's conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've known for a long time that the demographics of our volunteer base has been changing. And as the bulk of our volunteers are still have been in the retiree category, and which has had an impact because those folks have been more at risk during the pandemic. Also that, many of us haven't been set up to do virtual volunteering or, any kind of digital volunteering to the greatest extent we could. I think we all knew that was something that younger populations were looking for. And the pandemic has, again, exacerbated both that opportunity and that need. So there's some really important things to think about when we think about, what would a volunteer strategy look like to engage our communities going forward. And I think the time is right to start thinking about local, provincial, national volunteer strategies.
And that you made I'm so just looking at the chat now and appreciate your comments, everyone. You mentioned this shift to virtual, and I see that is a pretty common theme in some of the observations in terms of either delivery and or engagement. So Cathy, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what has the sector learned about going virtual from the past 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big learnings for sure is that we should have invested in technology a lot more than we did previously. And I think some of us have been better at that than others. Some of us have had funders that, thought that technology was important, and others, it has not been a priority. So that was a bit, especially in the early part of that pandemic, that was a bit of a chasm in our sector. Those that were, ready, had laptops and cloud computing and were able to pivot overnight quickly, and those that staff had desktops, they couldn't actually work from home. They had no policies to work from home. So I think the actual physical technology and investment in technology is clearly an issue. And then the connected to that, of course, is remote work. And for most of us in our sector, especially in the human services part of our sector, remote work has never been a priority or an opportunity. So suddenly we have people doing important work. It could be counseling, like from their own homes. And do they have the equipment? Is that part of our workplace? Do we have insurance to cover that? How do we pay? Do we have to buy them a chair? Like everything was on the table in terms of all of the nitty gritty details of how to set up a workforce remotely. The spin-off side to that is that there are benefits to remote work, and many sectors, including ours, were probably slower to adapt to that. And I think that's not going to go away. The hybrid model and allowing employees to work remotely, especially if there's other things happening, elder care, child care, that's part of their lives, that I think is here to stay, and that could actually benefit work-life balance going forward. So there is a potentially positive spin-off effect from that, but it really has thrown our sector in a loop. for having to deal with that. And then of course the vaccination policies and all of those things as we have returned to work and then not returned to work and returned to work and not returned to work about 5 times now.
Yeah. And I love when things align, because I look at the comments in the chat that we've shared as a group, and that definitely kind of mimics what mirrors, sorry, what Cathy has said around the tension around working from home, the privacy issues there. Yeah, and just expecting people to have a space where they can work from home, right? That's been a huge challenge for especially smaller organizations. And the logistics of, yeah, you owe me a chair now. And you know what? Fair enough. If you're sitting in something 8 hours a day, we want our people to be comfortable, right?
And let's, we can all in Guelph Wellington talk about rural internet, because my internet stinks out here in Erin, and I'm not in I'm not in rural or northern Ontario. So we do not have access to good internet for our employees, for our staff, for our students, for our clients.
So I'm also in the county, but I'm in Elora, and I will admit that I do take my high speed internet for granted. So yes. Equal internet for Erin. We'll get a hashtag going there for you. Cathy, what are some of the success stories that we can look back on from the past 2 years as we think about and heading towards maybe some learnings for us? But what are some of the success stories that you can point to as a sector?
I think there's so many, to be honest, and sometimes this doesn't get the attention because we are, continually advocating for more funding and more supports and all of those things. But so many organizations were able to pivot overnight, or within a short, maybe not overnight, but over a week or two. And communities still got service. They got mental health counseling and family counseling. The food banks pivoted without their volunteer programs. Seniors visiting programs started, transition to phone check-ins. So there's so many examples of how organizations figured out a way to continue to serve their communities who needed their help more than ever before.
Right.
And even in our arts and sports, being able to do coaching clinics online, so many virtual art exhibits that we're able to pivot to, bring some joy, theater productions and, little theater productions that we're able to do that as well. So there's some amazing examples of how the sector stepped up and continued to, despite the uncertainty around them, how they were going to get funding, how, when they could reopen, when their volunteers could come back, just plowed ahead and said, okay, let's get through today. Okay, let's get through this week. Let's get through this month. And 2 years later, here we are. But some fantastic examples. And the other thing I would say is that this is my 30th year working in the sector and 10 years for ONN. And I have never seen such collaboration, such sharing, such here's my policy on vaccination. Here, how are you doing that? Here's how I'm recruiting staff. Here's a funding application. I have never seen such strong collaboration, and we're all in this together, than I have seen in the last couple of years.
There's some great questions in the chat. Keep them coming, and we'll get to those. Let's drill down on that collaboration piece. Has that been formal? Have you seen new structures come together, through the pandemic? I'm wondering how has that collaboration happened? Has it just been by the seat of her pants, or have you seen more infrastructure built around that idea?
Yeah, but both. And, I've certainly, in some communities, especially bigger ones, York, Peel, Toronto, there's been community clusters. So cluster tables, which have formed in the pandemic to make sure certain communities and neighborhoods were served, and organizations are coming together and sharing resources in a way that they hadn't before. We're certainly seeing some, mergers and affiliations happen when an organization just couldn't keep the doors open, and others have recognized what an important service they provided to the community. We're seeing the rise of, which is also one of the new norms, the rise of sort of mutual aid networks or grassroots organizing without going through formal incorporated nonprofits and charities, and yet still connecting to those organizations and trying to work together effectively. So I think there's a real mix of informal collaboration happening, as well as more formal structures being put in place. And some of those planning tables or clusters or other things, I think we're hearing it, are going to continue go through past the pandemic, because it's been so useful to share information.
Paint us a picture of what some of this more casual or informal, like, what does that look like? I think we can all imagine what a cluster table looks like, people getting together physically or virtually, but what are some of those, use some interesting language there around the informality of some of this. What does that look like?
Yeah, and I think this is probably quite common in crises over the years and in other jurisdictions as well. But we've certainly seen a growth in one phrase that's being used to describe it is called mutual aid. So essentially neighbors helping neighbors, and organize it without a structured organization, but communities forming together to say, okay, let's make sure everybody on our street has food when the grocery store is closed, or when making sure that people have food delivery if they can't get to the grocery store, or rides to vaccination clinics, or any of those types of supports. And in the pandemic, there's definitely been a rise in those kind of informal Facebook groups, community groups, often racialized groups, Black-led groups, supporting communities to be able to access the services or supports that they need. And not worrying about going through a formal structured organization, which sometimes, as we all know, has processes and policies and application forms and intakes. So it's both a very positive thing in terms of, neighbors helping neighbors. It's also a challenge for our sector to think about, how we support communities using our structures without saying, no, you have to, here's our, 5 steps before you can become a volunteer, where someone's just going to go over, and join the local, Facebook group and support their community.
Yeah, that's really like, what is the market telling us when, like, what do we need to be hearing? We as a sector need to be hearing about people just getting together and getting stuff done, right? Like, what's that message? That's it's exciting, and I do not want to take away from the impact it's had. Potentially, is that a threat for us? Like, is that something we need to be worried about at all? Walk me off a ledge if I'm.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a threat, but I would call it a wake-up call.
Okay.
I do think it is important for us to recognize that, as our sector, and I think we could all agree that has professionalized over the years and formalized some, and certainly parts of our sector has formalized more than others. That in itself does create some barriers to participation, whether it's for, the people we serve or for volunteers. And so thinking about, I think the pandemic has really forced us to think about, do we need all of these processes and policies in place? Just like government has been forced to think about, and funders have been forced to think about, do we actually need this 10-page application form? Let's just do a 1-page and get the money out the door. The same thing, I think, from our sector's perspective, it's a good opportunity to think about how we can provide our services with and for community, alongside communities as well. So I don't see it as a capital R risk, but I do see it as, we really need to think about this, and we really need to think if that's what communities need, and if our whole mission is to meet our community's need, how do we need to adjust and do things differently?
And I guess tandem to that has been this awakening of the systemic barriers that our organizations intentionally or otherwise put in front of groups and individuals, right? So I think that's been another, I think there's something relatable there, or connected, sorry, that the pandemic has reminded us of the systemic barriers that exist for so many people in our communities. And we have to be we need to be having courageous conversations around that as well, I think.
Absolutely. And, most folks in our network, they call it the second pandemic in terms of anti-racism. And all of the issues that have risen in the last couple of years that we, have been there for, decades, if not millennia, if we're thinking about how we treat our Indigenous populations. And it really has been for many organizations in our sector, a real eye-opening. And many of us haven't used terms like white supremacy in our regular day-to-day conversations for, before these last couple of years. And so thinking about, both our services, but also our organizations and how we
Yes.
operate, our governance, and how,
Yeah.
that may or may not be colonial in nature. All of these things has been on top of the pandemic. To be honest, it's overwhelming. And the biggest thing we're hearing from the sector is we're just so overwhelmed with all the system change that needs to happen. Our healthcare systems need to change, how we provide mental health services and the funding for it, how we, certainly how we support Black, Indigenous, and racialized populations. There's so much to think about. That the pandemic has really risen to the top. In some ways, it's a great opportunity to just sort of, blow everything up and start afresh. But in other ways, we're pretty burnt out at this point. So to try and reimagine a future after 2 years of this is in itself going to be a considerable challenge for our sector.
Yeah, well, let's go there, because that's yesterday's conversation. For those of you that were able to join us, we were chatting with Mike Moss from YMCA Workwell, and around this idea of burnout and energy levels and how we're engaging our teams. And I see lots of good questions in the chat as well. So I'm going to try to circle back to that. But Cathy, while we're here, like courageously, we're all freaking tired, right? And we're all overwhelmed and our systems are stretched. And yet, no better, like this seems like the absolute opportune time to either blow the whole damn thing up or make some really significant changes. Like that's a real tension, is it not?
Mm-hmm. It is a real tension. And I don't think it's, either or. I think there are things being blown up, whether we like it or not. And there are things that we need to, play a more conscious part in changing the things around us. Like, look at what's, certainly happening in our democracy these days. And so there are things that we can't ignore anymore about the systemic issues that, underpin the very work that our sector is intended to do. And at the same time, we have to keep those service. A great example, of course, everybody will recognize something like food insecurity. There's real issues about why we have, high levels of food insecurity around ODSP payments and, living wages and all of those things. But at the same time, as we advocate for that, we have to make sure that people don't go hungry today. So that balance of, system change and future forward and meeting the needs of our communities, I think that balance is getting trickier. But I would say that, the exciting part is that we all have a role to play in that systemic change piece, which maybe a lot of us didn't recognize a couple of years ago.
Right. And maybe building on that, Sarah's got an interesting question here around employment trends. Are people leaving the sector because of that burnout? Are they, and what's the impact of that on finding good, qualified, skilled people? Wondering if you have any thoughts or insights on that, Cathy, around how this burnout is impacting our ability to recruit and retain the great people we need to be doing our work.
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue right now. Probably since December, every conversation we've had with the nonprofit, every convening we've had, every meeting we've had, the staffing crisis has been top of everybody's lists in terms of what's keeping them up at night. Both, I think people are leaving because they're burnt out and they're tired. I think they're leaving because we're getting poached by the public sector, who is short of staff and they have better pay and benefits, especially in social and health services. So lots of folks would prefer to work in our sector. But, if they can get paid more by a municipality or a province or, a larger organization, they are leaving. We are also seeing folks take the time that they need to either be well or take care of their kids or, whatever else has been happening, around them. So we're seeing a significant resignation level in our sector. We don't have firm numbers at the moment. We're going to do another survey right after the fiscal year end in March 31st to kind of get a sense of how organizations have been doing since our last survey. But we're certainly seeing tons of staffing shortages and a hard time recruiting for a couple reasons. One, our salaries and benefits are not keeping pace with our competitors. And if you think about Tim Hortons giving, $1,000 signing bonuses, and some of our organizations are paying $18 for frontline service provider, it's, why would you do this work? And secondly, our post-secondary institutions aren't keeping up with the skills that our sector needs.
Oh, interesting.
And in terms of some of the professional jobs that we need in our sector.
Anne Marie's made a great comment here that she thinks the pandemic has amplified the stress and strain of our Indigenous and racialized staff disproportionately. They are exhausted and discouraged. And I think that's a very real conversation we need to be having as well around, and back to that systemic oppression lens that we need to be putting in all our conversations. Any thoughts on how, and it's a hard question, but any thoughts on, or any best practices you can point to around how we can be supporting our staff like that?
Yeah, such a good question and an astute observation. We actually just started in July a project called Decent Work and Racial Justice. We've been working on decent work for a long time. And we're really now thinking about what does it mean? How can the nonprofit sector create a decent work environment that embeds racial justice? So thinking about, how do we treat our employees that are racialized? Do they need different supports than our other employees? What does that look like? How do we, everything from how do we compensate to, what do we consider cultural holidays, and how do we think about wellness days? So we're just getting started. We're doing some research and convening and putting some tools up there. We have an online resource center. So that's over the next 3 years, we have a long-term commitment to this work. So hopefully we'll have some more stories and examples and templates going forward. But, I think my own personal learning, and 70% of our staff at ONN identify as racialized. And my own personal learning has been, it's back to if any of you have parents or are parents, that there's that difference between fair and equal. How do you treat your kids fairly, but maybe not equally, or equal, but not fairly? And I think there are some things that we do need to think about in our sectors so that we can support employees that perhaps need more supports, or different kinds of supports, or better income levels, or different kinds of benefit packages that include, for example, Black practitioners that are available for those things. So we need to really start thinking creatively and listen to our colleagues in this space about what they need, because they have been impacted more than many of the rest of us.
Right. Back to the great answer. Thank you for that. Back to we've got a question here around the Great Resignation and the impact it's had in the sector. Cathy, are people leaving the sector entirely, or do you think they're leaving for other organizations? Are they leaving? Can you any more insights on that? There's a comment here that perhaps staff members are leaving for other organizations in the sector rather than the sector itself. I'm just wondering if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, so again, no hard research at this point, but anecdotally, we're certainly hearing that they're going to bigger organizations that tend to have better salaries and more structures in place, better benefits and pension plans. Where they can stay in the sector, most of our workers do actually want to work in the sector. That's why they came to us in the first place.
Right.
Some are definitely going to government or quasi-government agencies for sure. Again, often for salaries or longer term contracts. The contract length in our sector is still a problem. Short-term contracts, no benefits, which I would kind of put squarely also in the funders problem area, but we can talk about funders in a moment. So I think there's some of that happening. And I just think the burnout level, if you've been working in a shelter or frontline service delivery throughout the pandemic, and you're hearing stories, you're seeing examples every single day, and it is trauma. And so we need to think better about trauma-informed work and how we support our employees. And perhaps it's okay that you can only do that for a short period of time, and then you need to do something else.
Right. Let's, I want to come back to the funder piece, and a question I've got in the back of my mind, and maybe this relates, and I want to, stay focused on what we can be learning and thinking about our new normals. How has the government's perception of our sector changed over the past 2 years? And I guess you probably come out with a provincial lens. So how is the
Yeah.
province, how is their view of the sector changed over the past 2 years, and what opportunities are there for us there?
Such an interesting question. I think so. I think two things. I think they have a renewed appreciation for the sector, not just because of this week that they declared, but I think they had no idea, like the ministers, the MPPs, the political staff, the bureaucrats. We've been talking to, I'm not kidding, like thousands of them over the last 2 years. And they had no idea that nonprofits were the ones that were delivering this service or keeping this door open, or providing that space for that vaccination clinic, or actually in the communities getting marginalized folks to get vaccinated. And so I think there was a bit of a, oh my goodness, we have this whole sector that's actually keeping our communities afloat during this time. So I think a lot more recognition, understanding that there is a sector, that they do incredible work in our communities, and they contribute to the economy. So I think that's awesome. I think secondly, they cannot get their heads around the breadth of our sector. Like they still want to really think about, okay, there's some sports organizations over here, or no, my ministry just deals with mental health services. So that's all I know as part of the nonprofit sector. And our calls for stabilization funding, for overall supports for the sector, have both federally, provincially, in every province in Canada, have not been answered, primarily because they kind of can't, they don't see us like the small business sector that's a big sector but quite diverse. They kind of don't have their heads around that yet. So I think it continues to be a real challenge. I think we've made huge inroads in recognizing that the services that our sector provides and the important work in our communities. I think we have a long way to go, and it's a double election year this year. So that's one of the things that we're focusing on.
Really interesting point. Can we be doing anything at a local level, like with our own organizations around that? Like, I think this is, because I heard partnership and sustainability at the front of our conversation, and I'm wondering, any advice for us as individual organizations, how we can be painting. I love that idea of making the comparison to small businesses, which come in all shapes and sizes, right? Mm-hmm. But the sector is equally diverse that way. Any thoughts on what we can be doing locally to support that?
Yeah, and a great example just structurally is that there is an associate minister in Ontario for small business, and we don't have a single even unit or department that I can work with on, in terms of nonprofit sector-wide issues. And we're working across 12 ministries, 15, right, 20 departments. So structurally, there's an issue there. But I think, even when you're talking to your MPs, your board, even your boards of directors, your staff, talking about, we are part of this sector. ONN's got a new infographic out that we released this week as part of Appreciation Week, with all those stats that Kurt talks about, that we're a proud part of this sector, and that we might be part of our own subsectors like mental health services or family children services or other types of subsectors. But overall, we have more in common than we don't, in terms of our governance, our volunteers, our funding systems, our recruitment of staff. So there's lots of ways that we can work together.
We got about 9 minutes left, and I want to flag Anne-Marie's put a resource in the chat by Dr. Kenneth Hardy, which from the Eichenberg Academy for Social Justice, Amazing Approach to Trauma-Informed Leadership. So that looks like a really interesting read. I think our reading lists are going to get longer after this week, everybody. We had some great books yesterday. And someone pointed out that I referred to our speaker yesterday as, I used the wrong name. Where was it? Did I say Mike? It's Jim Moss, not Mike. Yes, I went to high school with Mike Moss, so that's where we're coming from. Anyway, our speaker yesterday was Jim Moss from YWCA. So thank you for flagging that for me. Cathy, let's think about the last question to you, and maybe to all of us as a group. If there was one transformational change that you would like to see come out of the past 2 years, our collective experience as a sector going through this, what would that one change be? If there was a magic wand, you could do one thing, what would you do with it?
Oh,
And I encourage everyone to jump in the chat as well if you've got some thoughts on that.
Oh, there's so many things. I think the one that we have seen a shift on that I would love to see continue and change even more is how we're funded. And so I think both private and corporate foundations and even family foundations have suddenly realized that they can get money out the door using sort of more trust-based philanthropy and just use it for what you need it. Just, if you need to buy computers, great. If you need to pay staff, great. So there has been a renewed recognition that general operating expenses, not just, attractive new projects, but general operating expenses cost money, and our sector is powered by people. So people are like 80% of our budgets. And so we can't do, a project grant and expect that we'll have, be able to then turn on a dime when there's a crisis. So I think there's been a lot of movement in that. I hope there's not a slide back in terms of some of those funding changes. And certainly, I think there's an opportunity to continue to push for general operating support, for longer term contracts and agreements, for paying our people well as part of our agreements. And we've seen some good progress on that, and that could change the game for our sector, I think, and give us that breathing space to be able to then do the innovative and creative work that we really want to do.
I'm going to go here because I think it's a question we need to ask. Is there a role for mergers and acquisitions here as well? Like,
Yep.
What, in terms of how we think about structuring our sector itself,
Yep.
do we need to be looking inward a little bit on the role that each of our individual organizations play in our sector?
I think we always need to look inward, and there's always ways to improve how we do our services and programs. But I don't think there's a right answer to that. There isn't a single answer to that question. I often get asked almost every time I talk to folks, do we have too many nonprofits and charities? And I say yes and no. In a healthy democracy, a group of citizens can band together and join a nonprofit to provide a service in their community that they determine is necessary. And who are we to say, no, you can't do that? On the other hand, are there examples of duplication of services, of ways that we could be more efficient? Of course there are. Do those involve sharing staff? I mean, Pin and Trellis back in the day, we shared some staff members, and it was a great success. And so I think there's different ways that we can be creative around efficiencies and support. Sometimes that might mean organizations coming together as one. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we need 50 big organizations and get rid of all the small guys, because a lot of those small
Understood.
organizations are serving communities that are essential in our province and in our systems.
Yeah. Okay. Love it. Because that is some of the pushback we get, isn't it? Oh, there's too many of you. And I love your language.
Or you're not efficient.
That's right.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, I'll get off my soapbox, but if I hear one more time, nonprofits need to be more efficient. Have you ever ran a nonprofit? We are the most efficient we are more efficient than the business sector if you think about so much of what we do. And so, we need to challenge those assumptions at the same time as always look internally for better, better ways of doing things. And we have been behind technologically. So I think there are definitely efficiencies there to find.
Yeah, brilliant. Just looking at our comments here, and we got 4 minutes left. Anne-Marie's made a comment. Sharing infrastructure across some smaller organizations might be the way to go. Yeah, HR, IT, and many of us on this call, in fact, there was Trellis, there was PIN. We explored this idea of setting up a whole back-end infrastructure system way back in the day around sharing some of those. So I think there's that time maybe coming back up again. Cathy, thank you so much for your time and insights today. This has been a great conversation. I hope we're all leaving with a sense of that we are part of something bigger, and that the struggles that we're facing perhaps as an organization are similar to what is being faced. It's not unique to each of us. And to Cathy's point, the more we can be thinking together and working together on some of these larger challenges, I think the more we can be seizing those opportunities. Of course, doing this balance of making sure that we're looking after ourselves and our teams. Cathy, any last parting words you'd like us to hear before we say thank you?
Well, of course, it's Appreciation Week. So I do want to say, we certainly at ONN, there's 58,000 nonprofits in Ontario, 850,000 staff. We don't get to meet all of you and all of your teams, but we appreciate the work that everyone does every single day, which really does impact our communities in such a positive way. And it has been a rough couple of years, and but such amazing successes and so much work to be done. And I do hope you take good care of yourselves and take the time you need to rest up so that we can transform our sector and our communities together.
Excellent. Let's give Cathy a round of applause and thank her for her time and her insights, and of course, all the good work that she and her team at ONN does. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Another great conversation. Your presence here has been a gift. A reminder that we're meeting tomorrow and we're talking about the future of volunteerism. Kim is going to jump into the conversations tomorrow and be sharing her wisdom alongside with her colleagues from Volunteer Waterloo Region, Volunteer Halton, and Volunteer MBC. So we're meeting back here at noon tomorrow for another hour. On behalf of Kim from PIN Network and forsimple.words.ca, thank you for your time. Thanks for your insights, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Take good care.